Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Legal Lunch Bite. I am thrilled today to have my friend and fellow China mate, Jared Turner with Import Solutions here to talk about his latest trip to China.
Well, thanks,
Jared,
Jonathan. Thanks for having me with you.
Jared, so happy to have you. We get to hang out in person, but it's also fun to see you on the other side of the camera. I know you're a podcasting guru with much more experience than I have, so appreciated the tips before we went live, and really look forward to hearing about you. So I know a lot about you, but tell everyone about your entrepreneurship time in China, what you're doing now, and then I want to hear about your trip to China that you had this summer.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I moved to China in 2010. I had just finished an MBA, and I was looking for international opportunities, and I decided just to move there. So I just moved to China with my wife, and we had two kids at the time. It's kind of a crazy story, but I ended up working in market research. Then I worked for some Chinese investors. The way I frame is they had money and ideas, and I helped them kind of execute those ideas. And then my wife and I ended up I started two businesses, and my wife and I started one of them together. I started a publishing company. And then we also ended up opening China's first, best, and only cinnamon roll bakery, which is kind of random indeed. But it's still open today, 12 years later. Yeah, we did sell a few years ago. And so I've done a lot of business in China. Currently now I do sourcing procurement. I work with US clients, companies, help them source and manufacture items in China. And so I speak Chinese. I didn't speak Chinese when I got to China. I do now. And I've just been heavily involved in a lot of Chinese business and doing a lot of business in China for over a decade now.
Excellent. So I know you'll have some advice for other entrepreneurs who are still trying to crack China. I actually just got off a call this morning with a client that has been purchasing a lot of product from China, and they still feel like they're feeling things out a bit. So there are a lot of folks that are newer entrepreneurs that haven't been around the last 20 years doing business in China. And so I know you'll have some great thoughts for them. But I want to hear about the Chinese business environment. You were there on the ground, boots on the ground. Where were you, and what did you see? What's the vibe right now in China?
Yeah. Well, I was there, for business and for a little trip, also with my boys. But I was in Shanghai, Wuxi, Nanchang, and Xiamen and Fuzhou. And so I got to visit a number of factories and visit some, old associates and people I'm working with. So in general, I think really over the last COVID has had a really big impact on the country. Uh, and I hadn't been back to China for over 4 years. The last time I was there was in January 2020, and I left a week before they started closing everything down in Shanghai. And so it's been quite a while. And in talking to associates and friends, the thing I kept hearing from them was saying, "Hey, you're going back to China, but it's changed a lot. There's a lot of change in China." And now I'm used to change in China. Like after I had moved back to the States, I would still go back every 3, 4 months. And there's this restaurant I used to go to. I love it. It's gone, right? And things change. And so I was expecting a lot of change. When I got there, and I like to take bikes and cycle around the town and stuff and go to some places I'm familiar with. But as I was cycling around, I mean, yeah, I saw that normal change, but I didn't feel like I saw any very large change. And that wasn't until I was sitting and having multiple meetings and chats and dinners and stuff with friends and associates, foreign and Chinese friends. And what I really got the sense of is that the change, and I think this is going to be different regional in different areas, but in China and Shanghai and the Pearl Delta region there, um, the lockdowns due to COVID had a really big impact on the mindset of people. And I found that seemed to be a little bit more distrustful, I think, of the Chinese government, a little more jaded, a little less believing, and a little bit more of why there was it also formed the sense of community along people in their local neighbors and their neighbors, but also a little bit more sense of distrust and like, hey, every man for himself, which is a little different than China. Now, how does that filter back into the economy and business and stuff? I think what I have seen is that over the last 8 years, well, I guess probably the 6 years, starting with the Trump administration with the tariffs and everything, is that it started this decoupling and it's been furthermore propagated by like the CHIPS Act, which passed here in the Biden administration, and other things that the U.S. has been trying to decouple from China. Now, I don't think that's fully possible, and that I could talk a lot about this, but it has happened, and it is uh, hitting the Chinese economy, especially in the manufacturing sector. And so, what I have seen due to this is that I'm seeing more Chinese manufacturers trying to go international direct. Okay, so a lot of them seem to be more savvy in connecting with U.S. businesses and trying to do it directly. And it is a little more easier for U.S. businesses to do that. There are a lot of them are trying to be, I think, a little more above board, a little more professional in this sense. So, because they're trying, a lot of manufacturers, and I think this is a little bit more relevant to maybe listeners out there, they're trying to court, their clients. They're trying to build their clientele because their business is hurting, and they are looking for opportunities. They're looking. I found some Chinese manufacturers have now set up ways to take payments in U.S. dollars outside of China, because they want to keep their money outside of China. And so there's some of these things that are happening, I think, in the manufacturing, the sector, and in the sourcing sector. If we want to talk about consumption inside of China, that's also a little bit different aspect. But these type of things have definitely been having an impact, I think, on the Chinese economy.
That's great, and I can verify what you're saying about manufacturers getting a little more savvy. I think that there's still a big learning curve for the ones that I've been interacting with. Some of them come and they blunder. Others really have a decent feel for it, but the really smart ones know that it's best to partner with someone here stateside who really understands the market, understands the market segmentation, the customer base. And I've seen some really interesting propositions in terms of asking potential partners to do a joint venture, to invest capital. There have been some really creative areas. It's not just be our sharp end of the spear here and help us sell more product. It's thinking more creatively about what is someone in the U.S. going to be expecting in terms of a solid business partner, and then helping them vet whether or not that Chinese partner is going to be worth getting into business with.
Yeah, I have to agree with that.
So let's talk a little bit about your kind of business in China. I think that people who haven't lived there, they don't understand a lot about the Chinese business culture. They don't, in my view, they don't understand whether Chinese companies are comfortable with longer contracts or short contracts. That's my particular area of expertise. But for you, what do you find that would be most helpful to share with non-Chinese entrepreneurs about dealing with entrepreneurs in China, about dealing with factories, about dealing with employees?
Well, I think the number one thing is trust, right? It's always the question of, can I trust this factory? Can I trust this guy I am, want to do some business with? Now, I think the first thing is really, and this is a bit more meta, but I look into any entrepreneur says, are you trustworthy? All right. How are you conducting your business? Are you also worthy of trust? Okay. Because you are not going to be able to, in any long-term relationship, exact the same amount of trust, more trust than you're willing to give. Okay. You're not going to be able to exact more trust than you are worthy of. Right. So if you're not displaying this equal level of ethical conduct and all this stuff, then you probably aren't going to be able to expect the same from your partners. So I think that's a key thing. It's introspection to yourself. But really now, and really, if you're working with trying to find a partner that you can trust, I always think the best thing to do is you start small. Don't expect some great, like, oh, I want you to do maybe all of these things. Start somewhere with your client, and at that stage, is usually trust is not big, is not great, and you need to build that trust. You need to find different ways to build that trust. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, I'll go over to China and, I'll meet with them. And that's really important. And, we'll do dinners and we'll do all sorts of things like that. That can be very helpful, but also be cautious. Sometimes I've seen there are a lot of stories of Chinese, partners bringing people over, whining and dining them, only just to cheat you a little bit later. And so I think And going back, I get the core question is like, how do you actually maybe repeat that question, Jonathan, because I think I'm going off a tangent here.
No, you're doing great. I think it's really kind of best practices for companies that aren't used to dealing with China, right? I mean, the Chinese way of negotiating, like you said, of building relationships, of how do you ensure that that relationship is not just a surface relationship, and then whether or not that's even valuable down the road, that having that solid relationship. If US, we tend to be a lot more transactional. If you do what you say you're going to do, I'll trust you, and we don't need to spend a lot of time together. But in China, it's very much about getting more enveloped in the family and the community.
Yeah, I think that is important. Now, I'll give us some tips because I mean we can talk about this in like kind of a real general sense. Um, you know, one of the things I recommend people is that okay, if you're American, be American with these guys. They're not expecting to be Chinese. Okay, um, so uh, share things that are interesting to you. Um, and I think one of a great tip I would give anybody who's trying to build a relationship or try to do business in China is get WeChat. um, because a lot of times, you just want to keep everything over email, and that's traditionally how you're used to doing it. But in China, like 98% of the business, I just made that number up, but it's a very high percentage of business is done over WeChat. And when you have something like that, you can have chat groups, you can always be sharing pictures. You can also talk. You have like direct interaction immediately with that counterpart. You can joke about things. You can translate things in the app. And I think that is a great way to really establish a connection, a point of connection with a potential partner or a supplier. And you can be able to address issues really quickly as well. So it's a small thing, but I think it makes actually a really big difference because then that enhances your ability to communicate with that individual.
And do you think that works for employees, people that have entities in China or other key trusted people that may not be direct business partners, but are really more internal? And do you think that those informal channels really help?
Oh, absolutely. So, but let me understand specifically. You're saying like if you have a U.S. company has an employee in China,
Yeah.
absolutely, because that person has WeChat and they are talking to your suppliers on WeChat. And then the boss is like, oh, I want to have a summary of all this, right? And he wants it on email. Well, it's really what happens in those situations is that you got your person, your employee or contractor, or whomever it is in China, and they're trying to work with your manufacturers or partners or whatever in China. They're doing everything over WeChat, and you don't get on WeChat, and so you just want to do everything by email. Well, really effectively, what happens is that you are out of the loop and you get the leftovers, you get the summaries. You're not in the room when it happens, if you know what I mean. So
Hmm.
you are, yeah, and it takes a little extra work for them to actually go summarize everything and put it out there via email. So yes, I would get your people here on WeChat, and I make sure because everybody in China is absolutely using it.
Yeah. It was great. We've got probably a minute and a half left. So I'm curious, how valuable do you think your Chinese language skills are? This is a self-reflective discussion because
Mm.
you're in the business of Chinese language acquisition. I use Chinese in my business. Looking ahead, how valuable do you feel that people who are still dedicated to Chinese language acquisition are going to be in the future? Like, how important is Chinese going to be in the future?
I think it's incredibly helpful. Now, can you do business without Chinese? Absolutely. Um, but what I have found that using Chinese, and as consequence, if you learn Chinese, you're going to learn a lot about culture. Um, you are much better able to connect with someone. Imagine this: if you had your a spouse who doesn't speak your same language, how close is your relationship really going to be? And you do everything through Google Translate. Yeah, you can have a relationship, but it's not going to be as tight and strong. So, being able to speak the language allows you to connect in ways that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. And also dealing with government officials and government bureaucracy, it helps a lot of problems go away. Ultimately, what I like to say when dealing with bureaucracy and the Chinese government and different things, all you have to do is get that person to like you. And if they like you, they can say yes and they can make things go your way. If they don't like you, they don't have to help you and they can make things go worse for you. Same thing goes for Chinese partners. And so, all about a lot of the stuff is that getting people to like you and trust you well enough to do business and then being dependable and have enough integrity to do that business and do it all right.
That's great. Jared, we're at time. Thanks. 15 minutes goes quickly, but really appreciate you spending the time with us and getting us caught up on the latest that you saw in China.
Well, great. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for